Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, leftists, progressives, and social radicals, and welcome to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, leftist sports media, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections of sports, politics, and social activism. We are available for broadcast by Pacific Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many stations already are. If you can't listen live, we're also available via podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and the Google Play Store. Audio streams of our podcast and video editions are also available through our site and our friends at Urbana Public Television. To contact the show, NAS Radio Sports on Twitter and Instagram, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, and the NAS Radio hashtag on social media. We look forward to interacting with lots of sports fans and political activists who are seeing the intersections between the sports world and the politics of the world in which we live. We have got a whole lot to talk about this week on the show. Stadium shenanigans happening around the world of sports, the sports world reaction to some of the president's new policies, and, of course, the latest in the dumpster fire that is the institutional failings of Baylor University handling Title IX issues. All this and more coming up on this week's Not Another Sports Show. Well, we're going to get into it this week talking about the Women's March on Washington, which took place last weekend as President Trump was inaugurated. Numerous demonstrations and actions were taking place around the country and around the world, with people on every major continent demonstrating in response to the inauguration and promoting the Women's March on Washington. And we also saw the intersections of that in the sports world with Nicole Gibbs, Arian Foster, LeBron James all putting out solidarity statements on social media, and the NFL's DeAndre Levy even going to one of the protests and being there as a demonstrator himself. We also saw San Antonio Spurs coach Greg Popovich getting involved, and his whole statement is well worth listening to, well worth reading. It was an over 7-minute statement that he gave to the press about the Women's March on Washington and said, quote, "That message is important, and it could have been a whole lot of groups marching. And somebody said on TV, what's their message? Well, their message is obvious, that our president comes in with the lowest approval rating of anybody who ever came into office. And there's a majority of people out there, since Hillary won the popular vote, that don't buy his act. It's hard to be respectful of someone when we all have kids and we're watching him be misogynistic and xenophobic and racist and make fun of handicapped people. And what really bothers me are the people around him, the Sean Spicers, the Kellyanne Conways, the Rance Priebus's, that know who he is and actually have the cynical approach and disingenuous attitude to really defend him and try to make it look like he didn't say what he said," close quote. And Greg Popovich is absolutely correct here, that we're watching somebody engage in these kind of policies just as we come on the air right now. The executive order banning people of Muslim descent from countries into the United States, banning people of Muslim religion from certain countries, banning people based on national origin is unconstitutional. It is illegal. And it's a weird, frightening moment when I'm realizing that I'm agreeing with park rangers, juggalos, and even as we went to air today, Dick Cheney saying that the ban is against everything that America stands for. When you're in that weird moment where you actually have to utter the sentence, "I agree with Dick Cheney," you know that the situation is thoroughly messed up. You know that the situation is thoroughly problematic when you actually have to utter the sentence, "I agree with Dick Cheney." And this is one of those moments where I agree with Dick Cheney. And as a very far left person, somebody who's probably to your left, saying that sentence makes me kind of want to shower with steel wool, like that scene in Ace Ventura where he's taking the shower. That's what it really makes me want to feel like doing, having to say that. But I think it says something when it comes to such an extent that we are finding these strange bedfellows. And Greg Popovich noting that a lot of people are not buying the act, and we have people out there trying to make it look like he didn't say what he said and he didn't mean what he actually said. And the behavior that's coming out there and the very big pushback against any kind of media outlets that are getting into an oppositional mindset against the presidential administration. And that's usually not what the corporate press wants to do. It's usually not what the mainstream press wants to do, is to get into an adversarial relationship with those in positions of power. They very much like being the stenographers of the people in power, of taking the leaks, putting out the stories that the administration would like out there. And this is one of those occurrences where they might have to get into the adversarial relationship, and it's one that we certainly hope the media is going to get into an adversarial relationship with the current administration anytime it is going to engage in thoroughly reprehensible conduct. And it's well worth going and reading all of Greg Popovich's statement. It's well worth the read. It's well worth the listen to. But we certainly wanted to highlight Greg Popovich, again, coming out and speaking out and using his platform to talk about politics in the world in which he lives, and using that to get the intersection into the sports world. Well, we've got a whole bunch of other news to get into with This Week in Football News as we are getting ready for the Super Bowl on February 5th. It is time to talk a little bit about news in the NFL. In NFL news this week, the two protesters that hung the banner at US Bank Stadium during the Vikings-Bears game in Week 17 are now officially facing criminal charges. The banner was dropped from the US Bank Stadium in Minnesota, telling US Bank, which is the company that has the corporate naming rights to the stadium, to divest from the Dakota Access Pipeline, the pipeline that is being built in the Dakotas over indigenous land. And there are a number of indigenous water protectors and a number of solidarity activists that have been heavily involved in pushing back on that. In the waning days of the Obama administration, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers denied the easement to that, but with another executive order, President Trump has ordered going ahead with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so the demonstration actions, the banner drops, have continued in Week 17. We saw that happening with the activists outside of US Bank Stadium actually being able to get in with their gear and climbing up and putting the US Bank divest banner for no Dakota Access Pipeline in. They've been charged with disorderly conduct, trespassing, and burglary. And it's certainly going to be a very interesting case to see how they make a burglary charge stick or disorderly conduct. No, the disorderly conduct is the work that was done by the Dakota Access Pipeline advocates when they decided that they were going to break the pipeline up into chunks when they went forward to try to get the pipeline approved. That was the disorderly conduct, because they knew that if they went with the whole entire pipeline at one time for approval, they would have to go through a whole bunch of more environmental regulations. They'd have to go through a whole bunch more environmental safeguards, and they wanted to avoid the oversight. They wanted to avoid those safeguards. They wanted to avoid those safety studies, and so they broke it up into smaller chunks to make sure that that was avoided. That's some of the disorderly conduct, or the pulling up of indigenous territories and indigenous burial grounds and denying indigenous sovereignty to put this pipeline through and put it over their land when they have said no, is some disorderly conduct. And hanging a banner asking a bank to divest from this kind of immoral conduct is an act of conscience. It may be illegal, but it is certainly an act of conscience. Meanwhile, the NFL has again fumbled its handling of concussion spectrum injuries. This, of course, is a league with Commissioner Roger Goodell at the helm, who absolutely adores punishing players for any kind of violations of the rules. This is a commissioner, Roger Goodell, that absolutely loves catching players in violation of rules and policies and finding all sorts of punishments to give them. Well, During the wild card playoffs, as the Miami Dolphins were playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, Miami Dolphins quarterback Matt Moore was concussed during that January 8th game, and he was on the ground for a number of minutes in pain from the hit and left the game for one play. He was on the ground for minutes and left the game for one play. And the NFL said that he did not go through the concussion protocol and that he showed symptoms of a concussion and that the Dolphins should have kept him out of the game. But because they don't believe the team tried to purposely put him back in so fast, the team will not be punished. This is the second time that the NFL has had an issue with concussion spectrum injuries and teams putting a player back out there when it's known that the player likely suffered a concussion spectrum injury and put the player back out there. And the NFL has done nothing, literal nothing about it. The then St. Louis Rams, now the LA Rams, had their quarterback get smashed and had a concussion spectrum injury and was put back into the game without going through the concussion protocol. And the NFL said that they weren't going to punish the Rams for that direct violation of the concussion spectrum injury policy. They then came out during the offseason and said that any team that was going to violate the concussion spectrum injuries was going to be really harshly punished. And they described all these harsh punishments as, huge six-figure fines, the loss of draft picks. And they very much put out, here's how harsh our policies are going to be. Here's how hard we're going to crack down on teams. This is all the punishments. And at the time that they made those initial pronouncements, we were very much of the case that they can have all the punishments that they want. They actually have to enforce them in the first place. Having punishments on the books does not mean anything if you're not actually going to enforce them. Having rules on the books doesn't mean anything as long as you're not enforcing them. And they can have all the really harsh consequences they want to, saying for a team that violated the concussion protocols is going to have six-figure fines or loss of draft picks. But when it comes down to it, another case happens where a team violates very clearly, very, very clearly violates the concussion spectrum policy. And again, the NFL chooses to do literal nothing to that franchise. Literal nothing. They will not be punished. Coming after their July press conference, talking about how they were going to handle these issues more harshly, that they were going to nail teams for it. And of course, this all makes sense when you realize that the owners of the teams are Roger Goodell's boss, and he's not going to wrangle those kinds of feathers when it comes to his bosses. But when it comes to cracking down on the players, he's certainly more than interested in doing that. That he's certainly more interested in cracking down on players and cracking down on the strength of the union than he is in dealing with the franchises that are putting these players' long-term health and safety and well-being into very, very dire straits by putting them back into games in an unsafe condition and not following the collective bargained protocols. This is the same league that, again, highlighted how much they were going to stress punishments and have now, in a second incident, done literal nothing. But as we'll talk about later in the show, concussion spectrum injuries and the handling of those, we have a early frontrunner for worst commissioner in the world of sports happening, as we'll get into in hockey news a little bit later on in this broadcast. Well, the February 5th Super Bowl is coming up, and it is going to be hosted in Houston. And Texas is the site not only of the Super Bowl, but of a lot of political intrigue and attention, as the state of Texas is proposing to pass a very similar law to the one that North Carolina had. In North Carolina, it was HB 2. In Texas, it's Senate Bill 6, which is proposed to limit the ability of trans people to use the bathroom of their identified gender. That the small government conservatives in the state of Texas are pushing back and wanting to put a law on the books that would ban people using the bathroom of the identified gender. Small government conservatives. Small government, small enough that they can make sure that they're going to patrol which bathroom you use. Well, the Texas Association of Business, a very conservative organization, actually said that if this bill, Senate Bill 6, is passed and approved, it could potentially cause the loss of 185,000 jobs and cash losses as high as $8.5 billion. Now, it is too late for the NFL to really come in and weigh in and say anything and use its clout to potentially move the Super Bowl, because it's coming up in less than 2 weeks now, on February 5th. But there is two events coming from the NCAA's end. The women's Final Four coming up this spring, and the men's Final Four coming next year. And if this bill does become law, or if the bill is very likely to become law, we could see the NCAA potentially say something. Because the NCAA and its member committees and have actually went ahead with their member conferences and moved games out of North Carolina over its very similar bill, HB2, that the NCAA is on record doing that same thing with this same kind of bill in North Carolina, and we very likely could see that happening here. Did they not learn from North Carolina losing events? Did they not learn from the North Carolina governor losing his re-election campaign and being the spotlight of a number of people calling him out, and very rightfully so, for his actions as governor to push transphobic bigotry? Did they not learn from any of that? And here's hoping that the NCAA and its member conferences and its member committees continue with that strong stand that they were already willing to make, and the NFL could possibly weigh in here with the potentiality of this bill getting passed, with the Super Bowl coming in. There is going to be a lot of attention on Texas about this issue, and we need to smash transphobic bigotry, whether it's Senate Bill 6, House Bill 2, or any other pushes of transphobic bigotry, especially violence against trans people happening in communities across the country. That trans bigotry needs to be smashed and put into the dustbin of history. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, leftist sports media. We've just been discussing the sports world reaction to the Women's March that countered President Trump's inauguration, and the NFL marked failure to punish their owners for violating policies when it loves, and adores punishing players for potential problems. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, leftist sports media, we'll be analyzing the Atlanta Major League Baseball stadium deal, as owners now want even more public cash. A look at the legacy of Jackie Robinson, with his birthday being marked on January 31st, and the latest updates from the dumpster fire that is Baylor University's institutional failures of handling Title IX matters. And so we are going to move from the world of football into the politics of the baseball world this week on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. In Major League Baseball news, the Atlanta Braves stadium deal is one that we have been keeping an eye on this show for some time. From the violations of the open meetings law to the packing of public comments, only allowing the proponents of the stadium to get any kind of public say in the public comments at the Cobb County Commission, to the misuse of funds when it could easily be prioritized to the public school system of Atlanta. This stadium deal has been a horror show for anybody who has been paying attention on myriad issues. Well, after bilking millions from Cobb County for a stadium and pulling money that was meant to go for public parks to build this stadium. The owners of the Atlanta Braves Major League Baseball franchise are trying to get $14 million. Yes, they want $14 million more for the costs for the stadium, in particularly the costs for roads connecting to the stadium area. Cobb County said that they already spent $69.5 million on road projects, but the team says that the contract specifies for $14 million of stadium-related transportation improvements. And projects that were started before the stadium was going to be built should not count towards the total. It's very likely this case is going to go to court, as the Atlanta Major League Baseball franchise wants the public to finance even more of their private wealth development. The problem is, though, and the Braves really don't seem to have much of a case, that even if you take out all the projects that were started before the stadium was officially approved by the Cobb County Commission, they still paid for $17 million in transportation-related stadium improvements. They still paid for $17 million worth of transportation stadium improvements, and the contract only required $14 million. But the Atlanta team wants more from them. They want more. This is a franchise that already got millions in public money from Cobb County to build this stadium. They bilked this community of millions of dollars for private wealth development. And if they're very much that interested in having their own stadium, it's the common mantra here on this show: if you really want a stadium, then these billionaires can pay for it themselves. They can take the risk themselves. They can put in the private wealth development and the private risk to do that, rather than socializing the costs of their private wealth development. Meanwhile, the other indigenous named team in Major League Baseball, the Cleveland Indians, is back in the news after they made it all the way to the World Series, which they lost to the Chicago Cubs this past season. Commissioner Rob Manfred noted that during the World Series, quote, "I know that particular logo is offensive to some people, and all of us at Major League Baseball understand why," close quote. And of course, he's talking about the racist iconography of Chief Wahoo, the giant smiling-faced logo of the Cleveland Indians franchise. This logo is notoriously racist. It's a really ridiculous caricature of indigenous people. It's a cartoonized mascot, and it needs to have gone away. It's a product of a very bygone era of America's racist past, which of course is not to say that we're not racist anymore, but this is a piece that really needs to go away. It's part of a bygone era. It's part of an era that needs to be put away into the dustbin of history. We need to stop using indigenous iconography as mascots in sports and logos in sports, and can it and move on and find other things to use. The team has slowly been replacing it with the Block C on their caps, and as the primary team logo, they announced for the start of this upcoming season that they were going to use the Block C caps even more and phase out the caps with the Chief logo on them as well. And the team has acknowledged that it needs to go. Baseball has acknowledged that it needs to go. And with the 2019 All-Star Game going to Cleveland, and the fact that Cleveland is going to possibly be one of the top-tier teams in the next few years, there is going to be much more public attention about this logo. There is going to be much more public attention and public focus on this logo. It is time for that logo to go. It is time for that logo to be taken off and put into the dustbin of history, and not just be a secondary logo, but be a logo that is no more. That we need to get rid of indigenous iconography in sports, that this racist iconography needs to go. It needs to be out of sports. It needs to be avoided at all costs. It needs to be pulled off the shelves. It needs to be taken away by these franchises. And they have the option of getting a lot more public scrutiny and a lot more public media attention by having it, or they can simply get rid of it and avoid that public scrutiny, avoid that public attention, and do the right thing. But having these conversations is certainly a start, and having these conversations about the issue is movement in the right direction. I certainly hope that it does become more than just talk and we see some action as a result. Well, coming up this week is the birthday of Jackie Robinson. On January 31st, Jackie Robinson was born. Jackie Robinson, of course, being the very famous Major League Baseball player that desegregated Major League Baseball on April 15th, 1947. He was the first official person of color, black man, to be playing professional baseball. And if we've talked about with friend of the show, Adrian Burgos Jr., that there had been other mixed race players that were playing, but they were always constantly trying to find ways to circumvent the color line and not necessarily be the ones who initially wanted to break it, that there was bends in the color line for a number of years, but that Jackie Robinson, starting on April 15th of 1947 for the Brooklyn Dodgers, was the official breaking of the color line, smashing it very overtly. And when we talk about segregation in this country, it gets back to some of the issue of colorblindness, some of the issue that racism doesn't exist anymore because it's not as overt. And we see that in the mantra of how we talk about race and race relations in this country and how we talk about it even in the world of sports. That, of course, Jackie Robinson's story is one of those stories that gets brought up frequently when we are having those discussions about the sports world and when we're having those discussions about the civil rights movement. And largely that mantra ends up going with segregation, integration, celebration. And it's still a significant issue that we have not gone to celebration. We're still, in many cases, in the integration moment. That we're still in real integration, that it's not only just necessarily being a part, but being an active, meaningful part of communities, being an active, meaningful contributor, and allowing for those opportunities and not being treated as de facto second-class citizens. And the mantra of segregation, integration, celebration simply just takes away so much of the actual nuance and the actual discussion to be had. And it's certainly heartening to think that we've moved on from it, but it's not necessarily reality, as we do have a number of systemic issues that still need to be addressed. Jackie Robinson has been a very nuanced figure in American history, but however, he's very often either pulled by the right as a Republican hero for his membership of the Republican Party, which in the early 1960s, of course, was largely due to the involvement of many people being involved in the Republican Party, especially people of color, because that was the party of Abraham Lincoln in the mid-1960s. That started to shift. The demographics started to shift with the beginning of the Southern Strategy by Richard Nixon, as well as Lyndon Baines Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964-1965, that the combination of those things seemed to switch the demographics into the switch of the party demographics largely. Well, Jackie Robinson was born in 1919 in Georgia, very quickly moved to Pasadena, California with his mother, and had been involved in a number of sports. He got a sports scholarship to UCLA in football and baseball. He was also a basketball player, and baseball was not considered his top sport. Baseball wasn't even considered his top sport. And frequently, as a teen, he had to deal with racist fans, racist police officers, and as a teen, he was involved in pushing back against racist policing, which is something that we don't commonly think of with Jackie Robinson, that we have this mantra that Jackie Robinson was this very calm guy who did everything the right way and didn't buck at authority and didn't push back against illegality in a very direct way, that we tend to think of him as this calm guy who simply just took everything that was thrown at him, both, insults and actual beanballs, instead of looking at him as a man who really was one that wasn't going to put up with disrespect And if you've read his autobiography, I've Never Had It Made, it's very clear that he did not want to put up with disrespect. He was very, very much pushing back against people who disrespected him from a very, very young age. In fact, he had to watch his brother Mac, who was arguably probably a better athlete than Jackie, according to people who got to watch the both of them play, earn a silver medal in track in the 1936 Olympics and come back and only be able to get a job as a street sweeper. And Mac's brother was actually harangued and harassed by the police when he began to sweep the streets wearing his Olympic jacket, saying that his wearing the Olympic jacket was a bit too provocative, and it was provoking the public into looking at the issues of systemic racial segregation, that a man who could go represent our country couldn't find a better job than being a street sweeper when he got back into the States. Robinson then went into the Army, and he was court-martialed for not giving up his seat to a white officer. He almost faced a second court-martial when a white officer called a black private the N-word. And he stepped in and told the officer that you shouldn't speak to another person in those terms. The officer responded with the F word and then also called Jackie the N word. And so Jackie assaulted the officer. Not normally the Jackie Robinson we tend to think of, the guy who was, almost faced a second court-martial for attacking a man who used racist language directly to his face. This is not the Jackie Robinson we commonly think of and commonly associate with. In baseball, there was the campaign of Lester Rodney from the Daily Worker, the U.S. Communist Party's newspaper, and a decade before Martin Luther King Jr. and nonviolence really became a major topic of conversation, he's being asked to be nonviolent in the face of overt racial oppression when coming into Major League Baseball. And new info has come out that Rickey was hoping to bring in multiple players, that Robinson didn't have to go it alone. But when New York politics looked like it could be pressuring to end desegregation, Rickey rushed it, and so Robinson became the only one known. And so Branch Rickey could be known as the man who desegregated baseball instead of multiple New York politicians getting that notoriety. Well, in 1947, he was brought up to the Dodgers squad. He was spiked. He was thrown at. Teammates started a petition to kick him off the team. And the manager, Leo Durocher, actually told the rest of the team that if he can play, he can play. It doesn't matter if he's black, white, or has spots like or has stripes like a zebra. If he plays, he plays. And if you don't like it, you can be traded. Well, on April 22nd, 1947, in a game against the Philadelphia Phillies, and the Phillies' really ridiculous racist manager, a guy who used to play for the Yankees in the late 1930s, was actually suspended by Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis during his playing career for saying that he kept in shape during the offseason by freelancing as a cop and hitting black men with nightsticks, except he didn't use those terms on the actual radio, but yeah, he used the N-word as well. Well, that manager and his Philadelphia Phillies started chanting racial slurs at Robinson, and Robinson said in his autobiography, quote, "And I just tried to play ball and ignore the insults, but it was really getting to me. For one wild and crazed moment, I thought, to hell with Mr. Rickey's noble experiment. To hell with the image of the patient black freak I was supposed to create. I could throw down my bat, stride over to that Phillies dugout, grab one of those white SOBs, and smash his teeth in with my despised black fist. Then I could walk away from it all." Close quote. Does that sound like the Jackie Robinson we tend to think about and tend to know about? His teammates realized that Robinson couldn't be the one to fight back, and so they converged on the Phillies' dugout with baseball bats, demanding that they stop the racial taunts, and a brawl nearly took place during that game in April. He earned the Rookie of the Year. There was huge attendance, thousands of blacks attending almost all the games, home or away, that Robinson was playing in. And a lot of the push about Robinson, of course, comes just from that 1947 season. In the ensuing seasons, he was actually allowed to have more freedom, that Branch Rickey allowed him to start arguing with umpires for balls and strikes, that if somebody tried to spike him sliding in to a base that he was allowed to do it back, that he was allowed more latitude, and he felt a lot more comfortable in those years of his playing career than he had previously. And there's a lot of belief, the very common belief, because we focus so often just only on 1947, that Robinson's integration success was the right way to handle things. And it was the depiction that many whites used about how African Americans should be behaving in getting civil rights. That his way was the quote-unquote right way. And this was the move that Robinson himself knew that in the early year of his career in 1947, that he could face not only personal repercussions, but repercussions for other athletes if he didn't help be this integration pioneer and build this bridge of opportunity for other people. But we lose out so much about Robinson by not looking at his earlier life and not looking at the post-1947 career and his militancy, his much more ability to be comfortable in arguing balls and strikes, to spiking people who spiked him, and pushing that back. Well, he was called in to the House Un-American Activities Committee during the McCarthyist era of the 1950s and said, quote, "Negroes were stirred up long before there was a Communist Party, and they'll stay stirred up long after the party has disappeared, unless Jim Crow has disappeared by then as well. The fact that it's a communist who denounces injustice in the courts, police brutality, and lynching when it happens doesn't change the truth of the charges," close quote. When he was asked about singer and activist Paul Robeson, Robinson ended up giving cover to the House Un-American Activities Committee McCarthyism by criticizing Robeson. And it was something that during the 1960s, members of the Black Panther Party, members of Malcolm X's groups, and people who ascribed to Malcolm X's politics at the time pushed back against Robinson and called him, the white man's black man. Well, in an autobiography long after the fact, and when Robinson was able to look at the legacy of what he had said and the impacts of what he had said, stated, quote, "However, in those days, I had much more faith in the ultimate justice of the American white man than I have today. I would reject such an invitation if offered now. I have grown wiser and closer to the painful truths about America's destructiveness," close quote. Something we don't commonly think of when we think of Jackie Robinson either. Now, in 1955, there's more black players joining baseball. There's also the bus boycotts happening with Rosa Parks in December 1955. The killing of Emmett Till in the American South, in Mississippi, and that becoming the national news story about the extrajudicial killings that were happening in the American South. And Jackie Robinson, during that season, led the Dodgers to a World Series title and was arguing with spiking players that spiked him. And he was facing media pushback for being an outspoken person. For someone doing something to him and his responses, he was facing the media pushback. And when he retired in 1956, he was the number one speaker for the National American Association for Colored People. That the NAACP, he was the number one speaker. The number two speaker was Martin Luther King Jr. Now, in the 1960s, he was really critical of the lack of African-American managers, the lack of office personnel in front offices of Major League Baseball. In fact, during the last public appearance that he made at the World Series in 1972, he asked for there to be a greater presence of managers of color and managers in the front offices as well of people of color. And it's one of the last things that he was able to say about baseball before his death, that he was very outspoken about the fact that integration is not only just putting players out on the field, it's also getting them into the coaching positions, into the front office positions, and taking on those jobs in their aftermath of their playing career, which is still a very legitimate and very real criticism and very real discussion that we're having to this day. And the reality about Robinson is that we end up focusing solely on 1947. We focus on, him being the white man's black man, as Malcolm X's groups put it in the 1960s, and the Panthers started talking about it in the 1960s. That we don't tend to look at him past the 1947 or even before the 1947, that we've kind of frozen Jackie Robinson in amber proverbially and just solely focus on the 1947 actions and not what he had to say himself and not the feelings that he had and how much more comfortable he had felt being outspoken about injustice and pushing back against racist backlash when it was happening, and not just stoically taking it like he was forced to do in 1947. And seeing that in the legacy of Robinson, seeing that in the issues of very overt racial segregation and very racialized politics that we have in this country right now, we can learn a lot from the real legacy of Jackie Robinson there. We can learn a lot from what he actually had to say and see him in a lot more nuanced fashion than we have previously. And that is something that is very much important for as we go into the upcoming politics of 2017, that we should not ascribe to these politics of nonviolent protests being the only methods that should be accepted, and being disrespectful to people who want to deny your humanity is something that it should be obliged and put on, that the politics of nonviolence may work as one tactic, but we're not to simply throw out the rest of the diversity of tactics and the full range of tactics that can be used to push for justice. In college sports news, we do have an update about the raging garbage fire of institutional failure at Baylor University involving their football team. And trigger warning, we are going to be talking about issues of sexual assault and domestic violence in this story. Well, a new Title IX lawsuit was filed on Friday that alleges that Baylor players committed at least 52 rapes by at least 31 players in 4 years, that at least 31 players committed 52 rapes over the case of 4 years, and that the university gave one survivor who complained about these sexual assaults free tuition, and that football staff were using women to sleep with recruits to get them to come to Baylor. In the lawsuit, the survivor, who is given anonymity, said that she discussed her alleged sexual assault by then football player Trayvon Armstead and Mike Chapman. It also alleges that another player told her to tell a different story to police to keep the players out of trouble, and even called a member of the hostess group, the Baylor Bruins, to show up and tell police a very different story of the events to try to keep the players from getting in trouble. She alleges that players on frequent occurrences recorded video of sexual assaults on their phones and shared them with other teammates. She also says that after reporting to Baylor employees, one survivor was convinced to leave the school so they didn't have to do an investigation. Yes, she's alleging that a survivor was asked to leave the school so they didn't have to do an investigation into the matter, and that over the course of the years that she had looked into in this lawsuit, only 2 players had been asked to leave the school over allegations of sexual assault. She also mentioned the Baylor Bruins hostess program. One of the Baylor Bruins, of course, showing up in the allegations to try to push back against the survivors' allegations and try to prevent the football players from getting into trouble. During the plaintiff's incident, she alleges another member of the Bruins showed up and tried to counter her allegations to police and help cover for the football players. This lawsuit also noted that Mike Chapman was also reported for an alleged sexual assault of a student athletic trainer. So this was the second assault that he had been accused of. And instead of kicking him out of the school or bringing charges against him, he was allowed to continue to play football. And they moved the trainer to a women's team instead, so they didn't have to punish Chapman. And they gave her free tuition in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. They gave her a non-disclosure agreement and free tuition. And this lawsuit also discusses the, quote, show 'em a good time policy when it came to getting recruits into the school. This lawsuit alleges that players were allowed to get drugs, alcohol, and women in for parties, getting recruits into bars and strip clubs if they were underage, and alleges that coaching staff sent members of the Bruins hostess program to recruits' hotel rooms to sleep with them to try to get the recruits to go to Baylor. Baylor and its Title IX handling has just been a grotesque institutional failure, and the more and more we find out about their horrific failures of handling these policies, it's thoroughly disgusting, it's thoroughly frightening, and it's a set of stories that they keep coming out, and we certainly have to keep our eyes wide open and focus on them. I'm not shocked by these stories that come out, especially the use of women as de facto currency when you're not paying the players, which fits into the discussions that we had last week on the broadcast about the importance of paying college athletes and giving them the financial compensation so you don't have to turn women into de facto currency. And we need to push back and smash back and bash back against toxic masculinity and these intersections of toxic masculinity and the institutions of major sports and major collegiate sports. Because if an athlete and if a player is going to engage in such behavior, they need to be removed from the team. They need to be removed from that school environment for the safety of everybody, not just because they can keep playing and keep staying there because they get sacks or they can catch a ball or they can throw a ball. Meanwhile, Colorado's assistant football coach Joe Trumpkin has resigned, and trigger warning, we are going to be talking about domestic violence in this case. This came after allegations were made public by his ex-girlfriend that he had physically assaulted her a number of times during the course of their 3-year relationship. The team had suspended him without pay on January 10th after an investigation was opened by police, and he has officially resigned from the Colorado football team as a member of the coaching staff. And we will certainly be keeping an eye out on that story and other issues about these intersections of really toxic masculinity, domestic violence, and sexual violence in the world of sports. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We've just been discussing the dumpster fire at Baylor University and its institutional failings in handling Title IX issues. Major League Baseball starting to have more talks about dumping the racist logo of Chief Wahoo and about the very real necessity to recognize the true legacy of Jackie Robinson as his birthday comes up on January 31st. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, we'll be analyzing some stadium shenanigans around the world and talk about mixed martial artists mixing it up in the politics of oil pipelines. Here on Not Another Sports Show, we're going to get into our final segment of this week's broadcast with other sports news. In other sports news, the Olympics. We have had a number of discussions about the Olympics with Jules Boykoff, who wrote the book Power Games, about the political history of the Olympics. We also had an interview with Rio-based activist Teresa Williamson of Rio on Watch and Catalytic Communities about the effects that the Olympics were having, not only in Rio, but also the effects that the Olympics have as an institution. And we had talked about the white elephant stadiums, the prioritization of funding of stadiums rather than funding real social services. And the prioritization of funding of these stadiums could have real big problems for the world in sports, as well as the political world for residents in Rio. Well, probably one of their most famous stadiums is Maracanã Stadium. And Maracanã Stadium is a very, very famous soccer stadium in Rio. And they've had their electricity turned off. They've had a number of issues with their stadium. And this is the latest, that they've had their electricity formally turned off because they owe over $940,000 in unpaid electric bills. The construction company, Odebrecht, owes 43.6% of the cost, and the Rio Olympic Organizing Committee owes the rest of that cost. Rio organizers said that the electric company owes money from being a sponsor, and they owe money to the electric company during the games for the energy that was used. This really feels like, if you've seen the old movie Clerks, where they have the electrician that they need to come in and fix the bathroom lights that keep going out. But they don't want to pay that guy to come in and do that because he owes money to the video store, and so they're waiting for him to pay money to the video store before they pay him. That's what this really feels like here, and it just shows that the Olympics are not a boon, they're not a benefit for host cities, and the prioritization of funding of those projects is a horrific problem and should be one that is used not only in agitating and organizing in Rio, but agitating and organizing in potential host cities around the world to push back against the hosting of the Olympic Games. Meanwhile, in professional soccer, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the billionaire owners of the potential Major League Soccer franchise for Charlotte, it's a team that does not yet exist, won $87.5 million in public cash, half from Charlotte and half from the county, and they also want a $75 million loan from Mecklenburg County. Well, Michael Smith, the CEO of Charlotte Center City Partners, actually used, and this is in the annals of stadium discussions, in the annals of practices that have been done, probably one of the crassest and most disgusting. He highlighted the protests that took place in Charlotte after the police murder of Keith Lamont Scott. He highlighted the murder of Keith Lamont Scott and said, quote, "This is a $175 million public project. We as a city were changed last September. This is an opportunity for us to have a really large investment and think how we do it differently," close quote. He is trying to shill for a stadium by highlighting protests against citizens being killed by the police. That building a new soccer arena is somehow going to get us to think about how we're going to do things differently when it comes to police accountability. The crassness, the sheer tone-deaf crassness of using the death of a person at the hands of the state to shill for private funding for a stadium. To shill for funding for a stadium using the state killing a man. He then said, quote, "Landing an MLS franchise is nothing short of the defining accomplishment of our generation." That somehow this is going to be the defining accomplishment of a generation, to build a soccer stadium in Charlotte. The generation must really not be doing a whole lot if building a publicly funded soccer stadium for a billionaire owner is going to be the shining, crowning achievement. Well, Charlotte Mayor Jennifer Roberts said there wasn't time for a council meeting on the matter and that the members of the city council should just send her emails about the questions they had. She then called for a meeting at 4 p.m. on Friday to discuss the matter, with a vote very likely coming later on Friday. However, both that 4 p.m. meeting on Friday and the vote meeting were both canceled by the city of Charlotte at the last minute. But Mecklenburg County did approve $43.75 million in funds, plus $13 million worth of land for the stadium deal. But Charlotte has yet to do anything because people started to find out that the Charlotte Regional Visitors Authority said that they would get $1 billion coming in over 25 years, and that there would be 600 new jobs coming in. Well, if you do the math, as Neil DeMouse over at Field of Schemes did, you'd find out that would be about $100 million worth of cost for $40 million in revenue. Essentially, that Charlotte would be burning $60 million. And then spend $166,000 per job that they were going to bring in. Probably not the best investment. And of course, we will be watching this stadium deal as it continues to go forward. We have an early contender in worst commissioner in the world of sports for 2017, as Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the NHL, has said that the NHL will refuse to donate any money to the leading research firms on concussions and concussion spectrum injuries. The NHL is fighting a class action lawsuit and is now interested in Boston University turning over its research records, including the identifications of players who have donated their brains to be studied or pledged to donate their brains to be studied. They've also said there is no proven link between concussions and CTE, even though the science has shown there is a relationship between being hit in the head and long-term brain trauma of CTE. Gary Bettman is out here saying that there is no proven link, denying the science and refusing to research it. At least the NFL gave the money. Now, certainly they did try to control where those funds went to and tried to control everything related to those funds, but at least they gave funds. The NHL is just out here, no, we're not only not giving money, we're also going to deny that there's any research link. But in happier news to close out our broadcast, Sarah McMahon, the UFC bantamweight fighter, posted a picture of her wearing a shirt publicizing the Standing Rock resistance of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and followed it up with the comment of, quote, "I stand with Standing Rock. Clean drinking water and respecting burial grounds are the bare minimum of respect and human decency. No DAPL, #water is life." And this was also followed up by public social media comments coming from other people that were not Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey used her social media account to tweet out 2 statements to her feed. One of them was about Trump's executive order to go ahead with the Keystone XL pipeline as well as the Dakota Access oil pipelines. The next was a story about a Canadian oil pipeline that spilled 200,000 liters of oil into Aboriginal lands. Later on, a photo was posted by a Lakota woman with Ronda Rousey at Standing Rock, noting that Ronda Rousey and some of her friends had showed up at Standing Rock to stand in solidarity with them and also drop off a number of supplies to the resistance efforts that are still ongoing and will need to be ongoing at Dakota Access Pipeline areas in the Dakotas. And it was really intriguing to see her use their platform for this issue and not necessarily put out herself that she was involved in this activism. She didn't post the picture of her showing up there, that it was activists that were actually on the scene there that were putting up those photos. And she's using her platform to talk about the politics of oil pipelines. Certainly something to keep watching. And certainly, of course, she doesn't have all the greatest politics, especially on trans issues, but we'll take solidarity where we can get it at this point and continue to work on those issues of mixed consciousness with the general public, whether it's Ronda Rousey or the guy who lives down the street from you. We can work on issues of mixed consciousness, have those conversations, have those debates, and continue to work in building the world in which we want to live. Speaking of building the world in which we want to live, the Nashville Predators have partnered with a program of the YWCA called the MEND program, which is being run by Vanderbilt's all-time scorer in basketball, Shan Foster. And Foster is certainly highlighting a number of issues, especially toxic masculinity in the world of sports, and pushing the idea that men are going to be responsible for talking about it with other men. Men are going to be responsible for pushing back against toxic masculinity, and it's up to us to help push back against rape culture, and it's up to us to really take a stand that this kind of stuff is not going to be okay. This has been Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections of sports, politics, and radical activism. We are available via Pacifica Radio member network station broadcast, community and college radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are. If you can't listen live or you missed any of today's show, you can go back and listen to our audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and the Google Play Store. Audio streams of the podcast and video editions are available through our friends at Podbean and Urbana Public Television as well. To contact the show, it's at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter and Instagram, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, and the NAS Radio hashtag. We will be having a new site coming out very soon. We are still in the design stages of that, but we will get that out there for you very, very soon as another outlet, the home base for Not Another Sports Show. For all of us here at the broadcast, this has been Not Another Sports Show, radical the world of sports and politics, left sports media, and we will be back with you next week.